rational. Of course, it's logical. Of course, it's spiritual. Of course, it's real, and it actually appeals to our hearts and minds because it's saying, well, look here, observe the beautiful, powerful nature. Nature is one of the biggest open book that is constantly inviting us to see and witness Allah's power and might, and particularly his creative power. So this verse, let me translate this for you from the majestic Quran. وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ الرَّحْمَنُ الرَّحِيمُ. Your God is one God, there is no God beside him, the most compassionate, the most kind. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, in the cycle of night and day, and in the ships which sail the sea for the people's benefit, in the rain Allah sends down from the skies, bringing the dead earth to life and causing it to abound with all kinds of animals, in the movements of the winds and in the clouds which float between heaven and the earth. In all these things, there are signs for people who understand. Inna fi dhalika la ayatin liqawmi ya'qilun. In these are signs for those who understand, and that is what really Islam is all about, helping us to be people of understanding, ulul albab. And today, you know, our speaker, Dr. Imam Abdul-Azeez, is a scholar, is a trained medic, and also social scientist, and of course, you know, I class him as a wonderful Islamic worker. I'm an Islamic worker as well. I like using the word worker because, you know, we are people who serve Allah's deen, his book, his people, and you know, we do work. We are workers. You know, we are people who work really. And so I came across Dr. Abdul-Azeez through this wonderful book, The Imam and the Atheist. And this book was very beautifully, very kindly given to me by Mamoon, who is the manager of Claritas, the book, the publishers who published this book. And I read it, and I was just fascinated. It's really fascinating book, the way Imam Dr. Abdulaziz has presented 7 very powerful arguments for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. An uncle comes to him as an imam. This is what he does. This is what a good imam does. Dr. Abdulaziz, I've got Dr. Amjad Aziz here, Imam Abdul Hayy, I've got Sheikh Ibrahim, Whitney, he's actually American here, and we've got Lama Ikram here. These are my ulama here, and they're imams here as well. I'm just saying to them, this is what a good imam does. So this uncle comes complaining about his nephew who has become an atheist. And of course, as you can imagine, what terrible, sad information that is for any, you know, uncle or a father, okay? And the Imam then, you know, Dr. Abdulaziz takes this young man through 7 very powerful arguments, showing him, look, Allah is there, Allah is there, Allah is here, Allah is everywhere, okay? And he presents these powerful arguments. They are very famous, actually, in philosophy and in science, and through millennia, through human history, the argument for the design. It's a very famous one. Look, how can you have a design without a designer, okay? How can you have you know, something happening without there being a cause of it? There has to be a cause. You know, the ontological evidence. Again, you know, this is providing evidence from lots of things and saying, well, how can you not accept this evidence? Morality is a very powerful one, something that I have a, mashallah, very special interest in, and my 7 Steps to Moral Intelligence is one of the best sellers of. By the way, Mamoon, it's Cube. It's one of their best sellers, the 7 Steps to Moral Intelligence. Evolution, another amazing, the powerful argument for the Rabbul Alameen, the Rabb, is evolver, and reason, of course. Reason just says there has to be a creator. Otherwise, how could we have this amazing creation? And destiny. All these are 7 very powerful arguments, which we are going to learn more from our wonderful speaker today, Imam Dr. Abdul-Azeez. He's the co-founder and the senior Imam of the Tarbiya Institute in California. He possesses a diverse background in medicine, social sciences, Islamic theology. Imam Abdulaziz is trained in both the religious and secular sciences, authored multiple books and variety of articles and essays on various subjects. He's also admired for his captivating recitation of the Quran, deeply appreciated by California's Muslims. And that's where he lives, in California, USA. So we're really delighted, Imam Dr. Abdul-Azeez, that you have given your valuable time to us. And I hope I've got some of our HIFS students here. I've got lots of imams, I've got young professionals, and all sorts of wonderful people here who are eager to listen. And of course, we've got people on our Facebook and our YouTube as well, Karimia's YouTube. So inshallah, I hope a lot of people will be listening, and in the future as well, as this will be on. So over to you, Dr. Imam Abdul-Azeez. Can I just ask everybody to turn around and face the Imam now? You are sitting in the state of khutbah now, so no talking, just listen to the Imam as though you're in your Friday khutbah, inshallah.
جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I begin in the name of Almighty Allah. I invoke His peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May the peace of Allah be upon him and his family, his descendants, and his companions. And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to extend those blessings to the men and women that walk in their footsteps with fortitude. And I ask Allah to include us and our families and loved ones among them. Ameen. Dr. Hussain, Jazakallah khairan for the invitation, for this very generous introduction. I honestly don't like all these prefixes and suffixes and titles. I'd be very happy if you just called me Muhammad. That's the name that my friends use to address me. So I'm very grateful for the work that you do, the Karimia Institute, and for this invitation, and very humbled to be basically put on the hot seat, and for this simple book of mine to be a subject of interest. That is definitely something that I never expected, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has His way of perpetuating His own word. And so I'm grateful for your students as well, for those who follow your online platforms on social media, for the interest that they have in this particular book project. And I need your prayers, obviously, your du'as, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make this a sincere effort that stays, inshallah, in our record in the afterlife. Allahumma ameen. As for this particular book, I gotta say, this is something that is born out of painful personal experiences. And so the book obviously talks about, this fictitious but not so fictitious uncle, right? Like there isn't that particular uncle with that particular story, but I think there are so many uncles and so many of those nephews that have lost their faith in the community. And so that definitely has been a driving factor. Just me having to answer questions about faith and about God over the years. It has been a difficult undertaking, helping some of those young people restore their faith and so forth. But I have to say, though, that the primary impetus behind the book has been conversations that I've had with my own daughter, who, alhamdulillah, now is 22. And inshallah, she's having her nikah this summer. And back in the day, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, when she was still like in her mid-teens, I think she was 14 or 15, something like that. And she would basically come home from school, full of these questions. And she was going to public school, and I comment on public school in the book a little bit, and the impact that it's been having on our kids, especially in the Western world. She'd come home on the dinner table. She'd bring up questions, about God. And I remember vividly the first encounter I had with that. She said to me, "Dad, I hope you don't get mad at me, but there's this friend of mine at school that basically said, how can you prove that God exists? How, it's not something material. How do you prove something that is just cannot be proven?" And how do you conduct your entire life and affairs based on a farce, basically? And I was so like insulted deep inside, but I tried to kind of keep it cool, as they say. And um and it was right then and there that I think I conducted a little experiment for my daughter that looked like the cosmological argument. I didn't know back then. I had not really studied at length, Thomas Aquinas or Ghazali, on these matters. That was like about 7 years ago. As a traditional imam, I'm focused on, I come from the STEM background, right? So I have the medical background, I have the science background, that was important to me. And then it was the theology and the religious background. Philosophy has never been like such a big part, of my upbringing or my education. And so I cleared out the dinner table, and I asked my wife to remove everything from the dinner table. And my daughter was sitting across the table from me, and I said, close your eyes. And so I asked my wife to bring an empty bowl, and I put the bowl on the table. And I asked my daughter to open her eyes, and I asked her, okay, so what did you see before and what did you see after? And she said, before the table was clear, and after there was a bowl on the table. And so I said, what is the one thing that you assumed right away? And she said, well, I assumed that either you or somebody else put that bowl right here on the table. So I said, well, at some point there was no universe, and then the universe came to existence. What is the natural thing for us to assume? And then she's like, well, that someone made it. But then what if, someone that made it needed someone else to make it, right? And then, I told her, well, if we keep going like this, then it'll be like an infinite regression, and there has to be an original event. There's no way, it's like in pieces of dominoes. If you see them falling, then you'll assume that there was an initial piece that fell, and someone who exists outside of that series, kind of caused it to fall. And at the end of the conversation, I think my daughter was satisfied. And then I went to my bedroom afterwards, and I was really, like in the movies, when you close the door behind you, and then you're like all the emotions that you're hiding and kind of come to the surface. And then I told my wife, oh my God, that was really difficult. I can't believe that we managed to pull this off. So I felt that night that I preserved my daughter's faith. And then the next few months, it became like similar conversations, and I started reading about it. The things that the imam is not necessarily expected to know, right? Like I'm expected to answer questions about fiqh, or what the Malikis say about this and what the Hanafis argue about that. Even matters of aqidah, like I dabble a little bit with those who are interested in Ash'ari thought or Maturidi perspective or whatever. But I never thought that I really needed to understand philosophical perspectives as well. And so one night after the other, one week after the other, we went through all of these perspectives, and my daughter's faith was strong in the end. 6 months later, and she came to me and she said, "Dad, imagine how many other kids out there that could use this help. Why don't you write a book about this stuff?" I was like, oh my God, write a book? Who do you think I have all these counseling sessions and have all these khutbahs I need to prepare. I don't have time to write a book. And she said, honestly, that they'd be doing all of us a great service if you did that. So that was basically what launched me on this journey. And I started putting my notes together. And then I was attending a conference of imams in Istanbul in 2017, and that's when I met some of the brothers from Claritas. And I pitched the idea to one of them kind of randomly. I didn't think that, my ideas would be worthwhile, that anyone would want to publish them. So I said, hey, I'm working on this book project. Would you guys be interested in publishing it? And she said, you send me a manuscript. So I was like, it's way too early in its stages, to do a manuscript, but I can send you a proposal. So I sent the proposal, and they were excited about it, and they said, yeah, we want to work with you on this. So it took us about 2.5 years, to kind of finalize the project and get it edited and so forth. And then we were hit by the pandemic, so that didn't help. And then Alhamdulillah, it came to fruition, after the pandemic, and it's been published now for about a year. And I am grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the response, either whether here at home in America, or overseas in the English speaking world. It's been a humbling experience, alhamdulillah.
Oh, Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Abdulaziz, you have, let's say, can we say you have 35 minutes, and then we will have some question and answers then. Is that okay?
Oh, so I have the floor.
You have the floor.
All right.
Do you have a desk and a table? Do you have the camera?
You tell the Imam, take the microphone and speak. They're not going to disappoint you. You know how it is.
Yes.
All right. Bismillah. So I guess the other thing that there's a few things, obviously. I want to talk about the book itself, but I still want to share with you some of the other thoughts that occurred to me as I was putting the book together. I asked myself, okay, so who's the target audience here? If I were to write this, who am I writing it for? Or who am I writing it to? And then I realized that it's either that I'm writing this book for, teenagers, for young Muslims, growing up in the Western world, or perhaps I'm writing it for their parents and for their mentors and their teachers, if they were to kind of address their questions. So I wanted to focus on that. So I actually wrote the book and I designed it not with the atheists in mind, particularly. I think if I were to write a book that kind of engages atheists and go back and forth and present very forceful arguments, like the books of the apologetics, for example, I think that I would have written it differently. But I wanted this to be addressed primarily to an audience that is made of young Muslims and their parents and their teachers and their mentors. That was my focus. And so I asked myself, okay, what's the best way to do this, in an age where all these young people, kind of have, attention deficiency syndromes, and they don't have time to read anything. They're getting all of their knowledge in 10-second video pitches on TikTok or whatever. Well, TikTok was not really that, popular back in 2017 when I started working on the book project. But the point is, their attention span is very limited. So what do I do here? And I still want to write a book. I don't want to make a video about this stuff. And so, while I was going to grad school, I did a lot of, I studied philosophy, but I studied just pure philosophy. It wasn't philosophy that pertained to faith, necessarily. It was just, general philosophy. I was focused on political philosophy in particular because, that was part of my major. And so I went back and I borrowed the style that Plato used in order to write his, very, very famous work, the Republic. And in Plato's Republic, Plato here speaks on behalf of his teacher Socrates. And Socrates, is this great mystical figure. I mean, some Muslim scholars, I think some Muslim scholars from India, they actually think that Socrates perhaps was the prophet of his people, right? So he was a man of God, he's a monotheist, he's just this incredible figure. We know very little about Socrates that did not come from Plato himself, right? And so Plato conducts this sort of like fictitious dialogue between his teacher Socrates and members of his community, who basically come and ask him about, the perfect state. They come and ask him about justice, about equality, about equity, about what it means to be a human being, and about God and so forth. And Plato sort of like weaves his teacher's ideas, but many of those ideas are also mixed up with his own. It almost reminded me with Sheikh Mohamed Abdu, who did not write any books in his own time, but he used to give this dars, right, in his masjid in Cairo. And his student, Sheikh Rashid Rida, he was basically taking notes and writing down everything. So eventually, Sheikh Rashid Rida, published Tafsir al-Manar. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And Tafsir al-Manar is known to be Sheikh Muhammad Abdu's tafsir, even though it was written by his own students. So sometimes we don't know if those ideas are Sheikh Muhammad Abdu's or Sheikh Rashid Rida's. They kind of mixed up together. So I think with Socrates and Plato, it's almost the same thing. In the Republic, we don't know which is which, because it's nearly impossible to ascertain, which ideas belong to Socrates or which ideas belong to Plato. But again, I borrowed the style, and the style is a dialogue. People come and ask him questions, and he answers those questions. And through the dialogue, you're able to, kind of shed more light on what would have otherwise been very complex, conversations and ideas. You're able to kind of dissect things. It's like you're talking to a friend, for 45 minutes. The manner by which you have a conversation, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper as you go. And as you do it in a dialogue format, you're also able to address the refutations as well. And so you anticipate the response, and you anticipate, okay, what about this? And what about that? And then you kind of weave that into the conversation, into the dialogue. So you're able to hit much, much bigger ground, that way. But particularly interesting for me was the fact that this style was easier to process because it reads like a novel. It reads like a work of fiction, like drama. And the kids these days, they still read, Harry Potter or whatever. They read some of these things. So I wanted it to sound simpler, for them to process. So that kind of inspired, the dialogue, between the Imam and the uncle. And the uncle basically is lamenting, over what's going on with his own nephew. But the uncle and the nephew are basically representative of all these parents and, the kids that have lost their faith in the community. There is one particular incident, speaking of this nephew and coming and telling the Imam about his nephew, where and this was in 2014, 2015, something like that. So it's almost about 10 years ago. And the LGBTQ plus movement was kind of on the rise. Transgenderism was still kind of taking ground, especially right here in America. And I feel sometimes that, these changes take place in Europe first, and then, America is, I think, for the most part, continues to be relatively more conservative, than Europe. I mean, California is definitely very liberal, very progressive, but the American heartland is relatively more religious and more conservative. So it takes a little time, I think, for some of these ideas to start taking hold in American culture. So at that time, that sister came to me, and she was in tears, like absolutely brokenhearted, very, very upset. And she basically said that her son, who is in his mid-20s, first renounced his faith, became an atheist, lost his faith in Islam, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And to make matters worse, he basically became a transgender woman. So performed that surgery, kind of removed his genital organs and took hormones and so forth in order to become a full-fledged woman. And I remember the words of that sister still, kind of resonate in my ears to this day. She said, and I quote, "I lost my son to the wolves." And I don't know why that statement scared me so much, because I figured, oh my God, I mean, all of us, we're sending our kids out to the jungle every single morning, and then we expect them to come home at 4:30 or whatever, unharmed, unscathed. Like, how unrealistic that is. I am sending my lambs basically to the jungle where the wolves are, and I expect them to come home uninjured. That is just sounded like wishful thinking to me. And so these are the reasons that launched me on this book project, very personal reasons, but also, community reasons as well. And so, it's been about 10 years, I think, since I started, putting a lot of my thought into this. And that has completely changed me as a person. It changed my relationship with God. It changed my own faith, right? I see. I know that the Ash'aris, for example, they would be very excited about this book project because the Ash'aris believe that God can and must be proven, through a priori or a posteriori knowledge, whatever it is. But the Salafis, for example, if you look at, and I mean Salafi in its historic sense, in its Aqidah sense, not the Salafis as the Saudis, right? And so if you take Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, Ibn Taymiyyah was drastically opposed to the Ash'aris because Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective was, I don't want God to be a logical necessity. Because if God is a logical necessity, I mean, believing that the computer exists or that the table exists or that my cell phone exists because I see it with my own eyes empirically takes the fun out of faith. I want to choose God, right? I want to choose to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I refuse to live in a universe that has no God. That is the very meaning of faith. The very meaning of faith is that your knowledge is slightly short of certainty. And then you kind of cover that remaining ground by a leap. And when you take that leap, you use your own agency as a human being, and you basically make that determination for yourself. And so for the longest time, my entire life, I actually was more in line with Ibn Taymiyyah's thought when it came to faith. But then I also realized that there are people on the fence. There are people who are kind of like about to get taken by the wolves. Maybe we need to use Ash'ari perspectives or Maturidi arguments or Thomas Aquinas or whatever we can find to bring those people a little bit closer into the fold. And then once they have their faith restored, then we can go back to Ibn Taymiyyah's, Salafi perspective about accepting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a choice. And so my perspective here is to establish two things in the book. Number one, that God is, start with the plausibility of God, because atheism says that God is implausible, right? So I want to establish that God is plausible first. And then after that, I want to establish that God is probable. So if we start with the plausibility of God and then the probability of God, then that leaves us with about a 20%, sort of a little space here that I'm able to cover with my own faith. And so if I'm able to say that God is 80% or 75% probable, I am not interested in saying that God is 100% certitude, because again, then this goes into making God into a logical necessity, and therefore it's not a matter of faith anymore. This is just a matter of empirical evidence. I'm not intending to do that either, but I want to make the idea of God so probable. In fact, it becomes significantly more probable than the idea of not having God. And then after that, I use my own faith. And I'm not, if you read the book, I think every argument in and of itself is designed to create some type of certainty or some type of certitude about God. Again, I did this because I wanted to catch the ones on the edges and then bring them back into the fold. But in my heart, I am content with probability, right? And then after establishing that God is probable, then it becomes a matter of choice for me, whether I want to take God as my deity and as my Lord or not. And so that's where I stand. Faith for me continues to be a choice. So that has had a tremendous impact on me personally, intellectually, and spiritually. And I think that it had an impact on our community as well. It had an impact on our priorities. The last 10 years have witnessed tremendous upheavals, right, in the American context, in the American cultural milieu, in the American Muslim reality, and the way I myself and my community managed to deal with those upheavals, I think has become more effective because of this book project and because of the ideas and the thought processes that were engendered as a result of this book. So it impacted my style, it impacted my priorities, it impacted my messaging as an imam, it impacted my parenting style, it impacted, everything that I've been doing in the community pretty much ever since. My faith is in a much better and stronger space, alhamdulillah, right now. And, I even address my students sometimes and I say, at some point or the other, you have to choose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if it continues to be just a matter of arguments, you're
Assalamu
going.
alaikum, Imam
I'm sorry.
Abdulaziz.
Yes.
Um, Can I just share something from your book? Because what I'd like to the audience here and people listening to us on YouTube and Facebook to know is how wonderful your book is and how pithy and how well you've given the arguments. And I'm just going to share this, and I'd perhaps like you to comment on this. Is the argument of the design. You described that it was put forward by St. Aquinas and then Paley in the 18th century. And then you describe what it is. You say that this design argument, in a nutshell, the design argument states that the meticulous order of the universe, its consistency and precise design cannot be the work of random chance. It's simply too complex to be arbitrary. There's both purpose and order in the universe, pointing to a maker, to a designer. And you then said, interesting, how does the universe having a purpose lead to the conclusion that there is a maker? And you then, I think you mentioned the Paley's, Paley uses the watchmaker's analogy to explain this. Imagine for a second that you found a watch in the desert. What will you automatically assume? That it fell off someone's wrist. Yes, but you will also assume that someone made it, right? Of course. So this is a conversation, and I really like this. This is what you said. You were explaining why you've chosen the Plato's dialogue method to get this message across. So do you want to say something more about that design argument? I think it's you put it very succinctly here, and of course the Quran is full of these, isn't it? The nature passages of Quran are actually far more eloquent, far more plainer than Paley's ideas, to be honest, or anyone else's.
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are two different kinds of arguments, for the existence of God. One of them is what we call the a posteriori arguments, which are arguments based in observation by looking at the world around us. And then there are a priori arguments that are basically based in reason and rationality. We don't need any observation. We just need to think without any empirical evidence from nature. The teleological / design argument, in addition to the cosmological or the causality argument, those are both a posteriori because they are based in the observation of nature, and both of them come mostly from Thomas Aquinas, but I think in essence they also come from Ghazali. He was basically the teacher of all of those arguments, and so Aquinas himself did not believe that God is something that can be proven without observation, right? On the other hand, you have the ontological and the moral arguments that are entirely a priori. So if we take the design argument in particular, the design argument or the teleological argument looks at the end goals and the end purposes. It establishes the existence of a designer by looking at the function of the product or the function of the purpose of the product itself. So if there is an object that looks like this, for example, and it's hollow from the inside and it has coffee in it, then you will assume that this object was designed in order to carry coffee in it, or at least carry fluids in it, right? And it has like this little rubber band around it, to kind of create a little grip so that it does not slip from your hands. And then it has a little logo, and it looks like it's made for a purpose, as opposed to like a random rock, for example. And so when we look at an object like this, we realize right away, oh, this object is made particularly to basically carry fluids in it. And when you see that, you always come to the conclusion very, very easily and very rationally that someone must have made it for that purpose. Because it is purposeful, then you have to realize that someone must have made it. So the design argument basically states that every object that has a purpose has a designer. The universe has a purpose, and that purpose, at least right here on Earth, is the sustaining of life. Therefore, the universe has a designer. And so if you examine the universe in almost every aspect of it, the universe basically has it's fine-tuned to achieve that ultimate purpose, and the purpose is the sustaining of life. And so if you look at the the percentages of oxygen versus hydrogen versus nitrogen in our atmosphere, for example, if you look at the intensity of our gravity, if you look at the balance between, dark matter and other types of matter, if you look at the balance between, space and matter and so forth in the universe, it is all finely tuned to literally these very thin life-supporting margins. A absolute micro adjustment to that would not sustain life. Like they even say, I think it's 10 to the power of 50 or something like this. If the balance between dark matter and other forces in the universe at the Big Bang was adjusted by 10 to the power of 50, there would have been no life, no opportunity for life in the universe. How can we possibly look at that and not come to a conclusion that this was done on purpose, right? That this was perfectly designed for the sustaining of life. So that is essentially what the design argument argues. And one of the things, by the way, to also conclude this point is that people are interested in physics. They are familiar with what they call cosmological singularities. These are the physical constants that we've discovered in physics, right? So if you're a student of physics, you know that the speed of light is constant. It does not change, right? I think it's like 300 kilometers per second. Slightly less actually than 299.99 thousand whatever kilometers per second. It's an absolute precise value. We have pi, for instance, which is 22/7. You have the acceleration of gravity, 9.8 meters per second square. You have the gravitational force, capital G. I think there's about 19 of those that exist in the universe, and we only discovered them, and we don't know why they're there, right? Why is the acceleration of gravity 9.8? Why not 9.7? Why not 10.2? It's an actual particular value. Without that actual particular value, it'd be impossible to sustain human life. So it seems that someone outside of this world inserted those values into the universe in order to give us basically a chance to survive. And if the universe is purposefully designed to support life, then it has to have a design.
I want our listeners here and those who are watching you here to get a bit more taste of the book, because inshallah, I'm hoping they'll all buy their copies at the end. But can I just the other argument, very interesting one, is the morality argument. Tell us something about that. What is it that this is an argument that we humans have this freedom of choice and a moral choice? How is this an argument for God?
So we all have a moral sense, every single one of us. Those who are Muslims, those who are Christian, those who are atheist, we all have some kind of moral sense. Deep in our hearts, we believe that stealing something that is not yours is wrong. The rape of a little child, or any type of rape, but particularly the rape of a particular child, of a young child, is so morally abhorrent to us. The events of Gaza, the murder of a civilian population, the entire world. I mean, maybe people may say otherwise for political correctness or expediency, but every single one of us in our hearts, we know that this is wrong. And you know that it is wrong, particularly when it happens to your own. So maybe you act like, callously or insensitively because it's happening to somebody else. But the minute it happens to your own, that's when you are outraged. And so it seems that objective morality, universal morality does exist. And all of us across time, I think this is not just a quality of our modern times. This is something that has always been in existence. And so the moral argument basically says this. Objective morality can only exist if God exists, because otherwise we would have no explanation for it. Where does it come from, right? Individual sort of subjective morality that changes from one locality to the other, we can find other explanations for that. But if you have objective universal morality that exists across the board, across the centuries, it can only exist in the presence of God, right? Premise number 2, objective morality does exist. Conclusion, God, who is the authority that produced that morality, also must exist as well. And so, it's these two premises that lead us, to the existence of God.
You quoted Kant here. You said,
Mhm.
so Kant held that a person cannot rationally desire this happy life without believing that moral actions can successfully achieve such an end. And this requires a belief that the universe is designed to achieve this end by moral means. This is
Correct.
equivalent to belief in God, a moral being who is ultimately responsible for the universe and the natural world. But before we go back to Kant, of course, there are lots of good psychologists now and neuroscientists who believe that, humans are actually hardwired to be moral. And they've done a lot of research to show that. And, I was reading some Chinese philosophers, even they have this very clear notion, for centuries millennia actually, that humans are actually hardwired, and it is the nature of humanity to actually be moral. Yes, okay,
100%.
you carry on with the Kant's idea then. Go on.
Yeah, I have to admit I really love Kant. I think he's the foremost philosopher of the modern era, and I think he really deserves to be read by Muslims. But aside from that, I think some atheists, if atheists were to respond to the moral argument, they have to do one of two things. They either invalidate premise one or they invalidate premise two. Because the moral argument basically says premise one says objective morality cannot exist without God. And then premise number two says objective morality does exist. Therefore, God exists because we are connecting objective morality with the existence of God. So it's either that they attack the first premise and disengaged objective morality from God and show us how objective morality can exist without God, or they attack premise two and show us that objective morality does not exist in the first place. Without doing either of those two steps, they're not going to be able to attack the moral argument, which I think, in my personal opinion, is actually one of the strongest, because it has nothing to do with observation. The moral argument is entirely about, the way our rationality works and how we see the world around us, right? And so if you take premise one, which connects objective morality with God, I mean, and so you accept that objective morality exists, but you're trying to show us that it was caused by something else other than God. But what could that possibly be? They would say laws. And we would say, well, laws change from one place to the other. What is accepted in one locality is not accepted in the other. That's the most arbitrary response. So that does not hold. They would say social mores and social expectations and social cultures and so forth. And we would say even that also changes across time and space, right? Or they would say sociobiological evolution. They would say we've evolved to become moral. And so if we've evolved to become moral, then there was at some point in our evolution a stage where we did not react. And so let's say that someone came, God forbid, to rape your own daughter. Today, we would kill that person. But what you're saying, if morality evolved through sociobiological evolution, then maybe 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, a man would be okay with a stranger coming and raping their daughter, right? And so objective morality is established not by looking at our actions, but rather by looking at our reactions. How do you react to when a moral atrocity is inflicted upon you? So you cannot disengage objective morality from God, because there is no other source for it. Where does it come from, right? And so you cannot attack premise one. If you want to attack premise two, then you need to show us that objective morality doesn't exist in the first place. This is just a farce. This is just a figment of our imagination. To which claim we would say, show me one case in the world where we would not react negatively if someone came and took something from us that is not theirs. When someone comes and hurts our family, if someone calls you fat, you're gonna overreact, very, very negatively. We would never say, well, in that person's culture, it's okay for them to rape little girls, in which case, it's fine, it's not a big deal. No, you're going to overreact and you're going to get very, very upset. When you look at what is happening in Gaza, or what is happening in the Sudan and so forth, we react and we think that this is bad. In fact, and let me end with this, the problem of evil, which atheists often use to attack the idea of God. How could a loving, graceful God allow for evil to happen in the world? We would say, you, by making that statement, just establish the existence of God, because you've acknowledged a particular moral standard, and you wanted to hold the rest of us up to the level of that standard, which would beg the question, who instilled that moral standard in your mind in the first place? Where does it come from? And we fall short of those moral standards all the time, but the standard does exist. And it begs the question, where does that standard come from if it does not come from the Creator himself?
You very succinctly summarized it in on page 79 when you said that that God is proven not only through the mere presence of objective morality, but also through the actions of moral people who still thrive in a world in which they should have disappeared a long time ago if evolutionary selection was the only way to explain things. Okay, and can we move on to perhaps the final? I know you've got 7 powerful arguments there. We've just looked at 2 because we haven't got much time, but I hope this opens well, this encourages people to go and read the book. But the other evidence that argument that I really was very impressed with is the evolution. So tell us something about how evolution is an evidence of the existence of God.
I suppose what I said in the book was that in the minds of many today, evolution seems like a contradiction to the existence of God. A lot of these young people, they go to high school, they go to college, they're taught Darwinism, they're taught the theory of evolution, and it posits itself as a pretty serious contender for the concept of creation. And we see, at least I know that is the case right here in America, religious Christians are inherently opposed to evolution because they think that evolution is a threat to their understanding of creation. And I talk about this, in the book, young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists or whatever. There's a whole, ethos around that in Christianity. We don't have that same problem, right? Because we believe that the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates doesn't have to be a matter of, just bringing something to existence. I mean, there is a process. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe in 6 days, then there was a graduality of coming into existence. And I think in the book, I argue that there are ways to reconcile evolution with creation. There are ways to accept the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have chosen evolution as a process by which he created things. I know that point becomes very thorny when it comes to Adam alayhi salam himself. Because at face value, the Quran, suggests that, Adam was brought to existence through the kun fayakun process, right? Be and it is. And I know that has always been our conventional understanding. Ibn al-Qayyim says, he deviates from that rule a little bit. And growing up, there was Dr. Abdul Sabur Shaheen, this foremost scholar in Egypt. He wrote a book that was titled Abi Adam, my father Adam. And in the book, he argues that it does not go against faith. And actually, as Al-Azhar University, they had this he actually included that in the preface of his own book. They had this big committee that observed the book in order to decide whether this is in line with Islamic orthodoxy or not. And they eventually, their ruling was, we don't like his conclusions, but it is not something that removes you from the faith. This is still within the accepted disagreement. So Dr. Shaheen's perspective was, that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the evolutionary process in order to bring this being, Adam alayhi salam, into the fore, and he endowed him with reason, he gave him free will, he gave him intelligence, and he made him the prophet of his people. And he uses a lot of arguments to establish that, Adam perhaps was the first human being in the sense of being intelligent and accountable, but he may not have necessarily been the first human being biologically, you know. And I know that this scares a lot of people, that the minute you say Adam may have had parents, I know some people lose their minds right away. But all I'm saying is that evolution is a language of science. And that's where we stand in the world scientifically at this point. Is it possible that in the next 200 years, we're going to discover a different perspective that will tell us a better story about the origin of life? I have no doubt. But as long as evolution continues to be the accepted perspective of science today, I think it does our young people a disservice to be dismissive of science. They look at their religious leaders and think, I can't listen to these guys. They are basically rejecting science. So we don't want to delve into that, you know, and rather take advantage of evolution and use it as an argument for the existence of God and for the creative process of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Than just completely dismiss it and fall into this type of error.
Well, we're coming to our Maghrib time here in Nottingham, but we're going to be delaying it. So few of you people who've come from outside to pray, please bear with us. Maghrib is till Isha, okay? So we won't take it till Isha, but we'll extend by at least 10, 15 minutes. So don't mind. If you have to go, please pray and you can go. But I like what you've said about how important it is to talk about evolution, because it's taught in all the schools. Our children know about it. And for us to dismiss it as nonsensical is absolutely illogical and unscientific. And I think perhaps almost against Quranic understanding, really. So we really, there's no problem with evolution as such. Yes, when it comes to, as you rightly said, the creation of Adam alayhi salam, then we have, we would say, oh no, he doesn't come from apes and monkeys. Alhamdulillah. Yes, we believe that. He doesn't come from them, all right? But we do believe in evolution, all right, up to, let's say, to Adam alayhi salam. There's no doubt whatsoever. You must be totally illogical not to believe that fact, because it is. I'm a biochemist, so and I know something about genetics, and I know this is a reality. Anyway, that's inshallah something which we do need to seriously talk with our young people, and because, as you rightly said, otherwise they'll think these are unscientific. If they're unscientific and we are scientific, we believe in science. Oh, we're at different.
You're superior to us.
Way of thinking, and so it's really it's a worrying trend, actually, which I'm really sad that many of our imams haven't understood it, and khutbah and scholars, and they're hiding away. And that's a wrong policy. We shouldn't hide away, and we should be very open about evolution. That evolution is a scientific fact. And I personally think it's in the Quran. When you talk about the Rabb who does Tarbiya, the very idea of a Rabb is to bring to perfection and completion things. Evolving, that's what it means, actually, the evolver. Anyway, this is something I think I hope we need to talk more about, without being scared, or that some extremists might knock us down. But that's fine. We should be brave enough to, because otherwise you're going to lose young people. And of course, the creation of Adam alayhi salam, we need to do a lot more research and thinking about. But of course, we accept. No doubt. When Allah says, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, we don't have any doubt in the fact that Allah is the maker of Adam alayhi salam, the creator of Adam alayhi salam. How he created him, we don't understand. But it wouldn't be too difficult to understand, knowing that nowadays we can clone things. Anyway, but that's another issue. We could talk about that. But have we got any questions? Who's looking at our... have we got some questions or not? Anybody like to hear? Those who are present here. Anybody, Dr. Asim? Anybody got any question they'd like to ask, Dr.?
Just briefly then, regarding he wanted the book to be applicable and to influence young people. Is he intending to disseminate his book into social media? I know he didn't want to do this in the first place, but young people with books, I think there might be some sort of tension there. So I was wondering if he was
Okay. Dr. Asim is a clinical pharmacist, and he's asking, have you got any future plans of making the book more accessible on social media for younger people? You know, you said you did it in this particular Plato's method of dialogue, which lends itself very good to, you know, and have you got any plans of sharing it on social media?
Actually, thank you for asking this question, because we ended up, we had a barrage of requests from people in the community asking us the same exact thing. That was about 6 or 7 months ago. And we actually ended up,
One of the slowest sales.
we ended up creating a video series that's been published on YouTube. And you know, let me send you the link. It's called The Age of Atheism. And it basically summarizes the book in a conversation between, you know, a talk show style between myself and one
There you are, Asim. Wonderful.
of our imams
Any
here.
more questions? Yeah, it'll be nice to have that link, Dr. Abdulaziz, so we can share it.
Yes, I'm
It's not-
sending it right now.
He says there's a Kindle version, and we'll share that link with you. Any more questions? Anyone? Daniel is a young year 9 student. Yes, Daniel.
Just started.
Young Muslims.
Yeah, loud.
We talked about the issue with young Muslims. There's people in my year group that they have very weak faith. What would the plan be to bring those people back to Islam? Because they'd be a worthy candidate of coming back, because they already have the original concepts which they've learned as a child. How would you bring those people back to Islam?
Did you understand? Did you get that, Dr. Abdulaziz?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
It's a very good question. I think it's yes.
And my answer is going to be quite unusual, I think, for what you would expect of me to say. You know, one of the reasons I think people in the modern era lose their faith has less to do with faith itself, and I think more to do with the climate or the milieu, the culture in which that faith is being practiced. And I'll give you a very simple example. The emphasis on science, technology, and engineering, for instance, you know, within our Muslim community, the emphasis on our kids going to medical school, our kids going to engineering school, our kids going to, you know, all the professional careers, which in my personal opinion is a lingering quality of the colonial era. But, you know, we can always talk about that later. But the point is, when you emphasize material sciences, when you emphasize the learning of, you know, engineering and you know, biology and all of these things that are all very, very material and very, very empirical, I think what this does is that it extinguishes the fire of imagination from people's hearts, right? Whereas if you look at, historically speaking, people studied the liberal arts, even in Muslim schools, in the madrasas, right? In the Nizamiya school system, they studied the liberal arts, they studied philosophy, they studied art, they studied poetry, right? All the beautiful things that made us yearn for more, that made us want to discover what's out there in the world, what's metaphysical. And so if you ask my opinion with someone like this, I would start by getting them to develop a taste for poetry. I would start by getting them to develop a taste for art. Because once you unleash your imagination, you're going to be at least open to the idea of God, as opposed to the hard, crude realities of the physical world that shut everything down, you know. And so maybe that would be a first step. You know, they have to develop some interest in artistic, beautiful, philosophical, you know, poetic things, and then that may, you know, they need to be enchanted first. You know, that's our world is disenchanted. We need some enchantment first.
MashaAllah, that's very beautiful. So really, two things you said. One is providing them the right atmosphere, environment where they are in company of people of faith. Of course, if they're going to be in company of Liverpool supporters and Man United supporters only, and that's all they live and talk about day and night, then of course it's not going to be much, you know. And the other one is, you know, this is really important because our young people are just learning technical subjects, scientific subjects, which are very good for your logic, for your mathematical thinking. But what about the other side of the other half of the brain, which needs artistic, poetic, challenges? And that's what they are poorer. Anyway, Jazakallah for that. Any other questions from our audience here? Sajid? Those who've got children, I'm sure, must be very worried. Okay, how do we preserve the iman in Allah, tawheed, and connections, with our spiritual realities? Anybody got a question?
Just the bit about objective morality being constantly attacked in the climates we live in. How can we counter that?
Okay. Sajid is our Quran designer. He designed the majestic Quran, mashallah. He asks that, there's attack on objective morality. In other words, morality is now regarded as relative. So you can have your morals sometimes and not others time, and in different places, different times. So how do we tackle that?
Yeah, again, that's exactly what they say. So if they attack objective morality, then they accept premise one, but they are attacking premise two, right? And so that's how we get them. Okay, so you're arguing that objective morality doesn't exist. All right, so tell me, if someone came and stole from you, would you be upset or not? And then that person would say, absolutely. And then we'd ask you, why do you feel bad? Why is it that every human being feels bad when something is taken away from them? Even if you deal with a culture of, I don't know, gypsies or barbarians or people who don't really care, like even if it's okay for them to take something that is not theirs, why are you being upset? And why would all of us be upset when something like, morally reprehensible happens to us? So I think the way to address this is not by commenting on our actions, but like I said, by commenting on our reactions. We are more than willing to commit immoral acts, but if someone commits immoral acts against us, we all react the same way. And if we all react the same way, that means, we all have some objective morality that has been ingrained in us. And I had a student, by the way, once that asked me, what about the Holocaust? Right? At some point, what about racism? At some point, racism was perfectly acceptable. If it was acceptable 200 years ago, it's not acceptable today. That means morality is relative. And I said, it wasn't acceptable for the slaves, right? If you're a slave yourself and you're not benefiting from the neglection of moral responsibility, you're upset. Right? And so just because white slave owners in America accepted it, it doesn't mean that it was okay. It certainly was not okay for those who were, the slaves themselves. So again, focus on the reaction and not the action. That's how you tackle this particular response.
And this, of course, the Quran is very consistent about the objectivity of morality throughout. It's got one position. It's about justice, it's about truth, it's about kindness, it's about compassion and forgiveness and gratitude, humility, constantly throughout. And every story has that, exactly, lesson in it. And wonderful. Final question, if anybody's got one here, those who are present here.
I do have a question.
Yes, Sheikh Ibrahim. Yes, Sheikh, tell us.
I'm having a hard time connecting. So if we have objective morality is connected to the existence of God, and then objective morality exists, therefore God exists. In my normal thinking, put it the other way. I put God exists, therefore we have objective morality. Would we be depending too much on thinkers like Hume and utilitarianism if we want to establish objective morality without the existence of God? And coupled to that, how can we depend just on that philosophy of, I feel offended, therefore I have moral grounds? Because we know that sometimes we hate something, but it's good for us, or sometimes we love something, but it's bad for us.
Right. I appreciate the question. So number one, I think the reference here is that the moral argument is one of many. This is not the only argument for God, so you always want to couple, this particular perspective with others as well. The moral argument does not operate independent of all the 5 or 6 other arguments for God. That's number one. And so we're not entirely dependent on this one. Like I said, I think it would be offensive for us to say, in order for God to exist, these arguments need to be successful. I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be above and beyond, all of these, petty human efforts to prove or disprove him. God does not come into and out of existence depending on whether the argument is successful or unsuccessful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always there. But we only use these arguments to help people come a little bit close to the faith, like I said earlier, to make the idea of God most probable, right? And so all we're saying here is that it is more probable, if objective morality exists in the world, it would be significantly more probable to say that the source of that objective morality comes from a moral authority that has made that objective morality possible and gave us as human beings our quote unquote marching orders. You need to act morally in the world. That's why we feel guilty when we act immorally, right? And so that's why I don't want to put too much stock into the usage of those arguments, but use them selectively in conjunction with each other. Now, the point that you raised, sometimes when something, وَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَى أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ, you love a thing and then you realize that it was bad for you and so forth. I think this refers more to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So if someone came, if you have a supervisor at work that was racist and that person fired you, maybe in the grand scheme of things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is Allah's way of putting you in a better job or a better career path. But it doesn't mean that the act itself was moral. What your supervisor did because they fired you because of your race, that was still bad, right? Although in the grand scheme of things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to show you that, yes, it was bad, but it was still better for you because, I'm going to give you a better option. So I don't think that we should confuse those two things.
And that takes us to the destiny. Well, Dr. Abdulaziz, thank you for this very stimulating, very interesting talk. I hope, we can invite you to UK, inshallah. Come on, everybody, say it.
Yeah. I'd be honored. I'd be honored.
Inshallah, I hope seriously, I think you've got, and because there are some very really strong Christian speakers on this as well, and perhaps a joint, where we could, because, we need to be showing that religion and faith is powerful. And we can be united on certain things. So this would be our opportunity to preach Tawheed to the Christians, and of course, preach God to the wider community, inshallah, Aziz. Anyway, that's something, inshallah, I hope we can talk about. Well, finally, Dr. Abdulaziz, may Allah bless you and your wonderful Institute of Tarbiya in California, and your family. And bless you for your wonderful work. And we pray that through this, you rescue those wounded by the wolves, and you save those who are on what the Quran would say, ala shafa hufratin minan nar. You may rescue them, inshallah, Aziz, through the power of Quran, and these amazing ideas, which of course are very Quranic ideas. So jazakallah khair wa ahsan al-jaza. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.